Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. As you know, the City of Clearwater has been working on a citywide vulnerability assessment with hopes to better understand how climate factors will impact the city in the near and distant future. This assessment, which started in October 2022, was funded by the State of Florida's Resilient Florida Grant Program for $197,848 with a required local match of $24,000. Under the guidance of a multidisciplinary technical advisory committee involving regional partners, the consultant firm Atkins Realis has created a digital twin of Clearwater to test vital community elements, including the natural, built, and social environments against several projected climate impacts, with the greatest priority being given to analyzing the impacts of flooding and heat. The project will result in a resiliency report, which will include project findings and serve as the basis to guide capital project investments, assist with planning of a future climate action plan, and identify alternatives that support social justice and cost-beneficial objectives of the city. Today, Atkins Realis will be presenting an overview of the project and preliminary results. So I'd like to introduce Chris Zambito. He's the project manager. Daniel Parsons is our project director, and Jeremy Brown is the city's deputy city engineer. And I'm Cassie Cordova, the sustainability division manager. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now for the presentation. We will open up the floor to questions from the public after the presentation. We'll ask that you come to the podium and limit your questions or comments to 3 minutes. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon, almost evening. Appreciate everybody taking some time to come out and listen to this exciting topic. We're talking here about a project that is a vulnerability assessment for the city of Clearwater, and this is something, if you're not aware, that the entire state is looking at in different portions. This is, as Cassie mentioned, it is funded through the state of Florida's Resilient Florida program. Different communities are taking different approaches to it. As she mentioned, we're looking at citywide heat, which is a little different than some communities are doing. It's really to build off of some of the Green Print 2.0 and the sustainability initiatives that are building with the city, in addition to some of the flood impacts to the community. What makes this a little different than what traditionally is done is that we use a systems approach to vulnerability that we're looking at. And so in this case here, we have a tool that's a geospatial tool. And what it's doing is it's simulating how the city grows into the future. So it is an agent-based model, which means that we use census data to look at where people live, where people work, and we simulate people actually going to and from work, tourists coming into the beaches every day over the next 80 years. And so the tool tries to make a synthetic version of the city and show how it grows and how it's impacted by different climate events into the future. So, the big benefit to this is it's grant funded. It's supporting future grants for you. A lot of communities that we do this for across the country use this in support of FEMA and other grant processes. Again, this is a little more realistic, I think, than some of the communities that just have a map that has a layer of flooding and a layer of buildings. This is looking at how traffic flows throughout the city. This is looking at where people live, where people work. Different occupations type gets factored into some of the heat models that we do. And then, this is ultimately going to be a planning tool that the city's going to have at their disposal to test different simulations into the future. We touched on a lot of this, but, the beginning of this project was really looking at, what the city wanted to get out of it, how we can integrate this with programs that you guys are already doing, looking at specific metrics that could be captured through a geospatial tool and reported out into the final report. This is an ongoing project. We're getting close to the end, so we wanted you to start to see some of the beginning parts of the products and where it's going. So from the Florida grant perspective here, there's some steps that we need to do. We started off by assembling a project action team, which is primarily city staff, so that when we have questions about the data or what data we need or what are decisions with future land use layers, that group works with that. Outside of that, we have a technical advisory committee. The technical advisory committee is a broader spectrum of people that is looking at, regional planning council, that's other people in Pinellas County that do sustainability, that's interacting with transportation planners that are regional. So it's another panel of experts that provides a different lens into the project. Then we do these simulation of the city, your building footprints, all that kind of information, traffic. We look at different weather phenomenon into the future, and we'll talk about all that, and then these reports and the public presentation. So the big first step you do is a baseline. So that's where we're simulating what the city looks like today and into the future. So just a little information here, as we're pulling all this data, this is pulled from the Department of Revenue site, looking at parcel information. This is just kind of a breakdown of your community fabric from the building inventory standpoint. A big majority of it is obviously single family, but you do have a very large condominium breakdown of the community. Across the bottom there, you have a graph that is kind of showing the development of the city over time. And so what you're seeing is relatively little development until the 60s, and then a lot of single-family development until the 80s. There was a condo boom, that's the darker color at the bottom. You see the condos kind of through the 80s, and the 90s you transition back into a single-family community, and it's pretty flat at the end. Clearwater is pretty much built out at this point. So now we're looking at redevelopment. To help facilitate how this model works and simulates communities, people moving through the city, there's FDOT data that gets incorporated into this. This is looking at your road network and emulating as best we can daily traffic patterns. So as we start to move towards the future conditions here, what we're looking at from the climate science perspective, we're looking at rainfall, we're looking at tidal events. On the flood side, so this is looking at rainfall. There's a lot of gauges that collect data across the area. We're looking at Clearwater's information primarily as the main gauge to drill from. And what we do here is we take a lot of the global models and they get downscaled for Clearwater and they get calibrated to your information. Now, because the intent of the tool is to stress test how the community can respond to different hazard events, it does use the highest curve from the global models to look at the most intense rain events that might happen. And what we're showing here is what we do is we take all those models and we create a series of synthetic storms to simulate how the city is going to be impacted over the future. So it's not saying prescriptively this is how the future happens. It takes the climate science, builds it into the model, and it goes year by year, 2030, 2040, 2041. Each of those years has an event. There might be a big rainfall event that only happens once every 20 years. In this case, with these synthetic storms, what happened is you had two large events that popped up that were kind of Ian-sized storms, so like a 100-year rain event, 11 to 12 inches of rain falling, and then you had 6 8-inch rainstorms. So as we simulate these events happening over time, different impacts to the community happen. In the sea level rise model, again, this is integrating global models, NOAA's model. This is looking at the Tampa Bay area. There's a climate science advisory panel. That group makes recommendations, so this is using that information and it's simulating, it's forecasting future tide information into the next 80 years. This is looking at some of the building footprints. And so this is kind of just some general exposure. The really interesting thing with the tool is it's a very data-rich tool. And so, it doesn't just have a flat number. It has numbers with context. So, in this particular case, this example is building footprints with an assumed finished floor elevation at a certain height. It's breaking down commercial versus residential, multifamily residential. So all this information will be at the city's disposal to decide how they want to implement that and how, when they're looking at future land use planning and looking at areas that are exposed to flood events. Another way to look at this is from the transportation standpoint. How much of your daily life is going to be impacted by this? So what this is doing is simulating areas of traffic against these different flood conditions and looking at how much disruption there is. So you can see, obviously, not unexpectedly at the coast, there's a lot of impact. There's a lot of impact along Stevenson Creek. There's a lot of impact over there on Tampa Bay and along some of the creek systems. So what this means is these could be areas that aren't traveled very heavily, but they have a huge impact, or it could be something that's getting hit all the time. And that's predominantly what you're seeing more, at the beach. Some of those areas, towards North Beach and stuff may not be extremely heavily traveled daily, but they are getting hit a lot into the future by flood events. One of the interesting things here, again, that's a little unique with you all is looking at future temperature and climate. We're seeing this more and more every year. We're hearing the area is warming, every year is getting a little hotter. This is looking at different trends in heat. And so what we do as a metric for this project is we're looking at days and temperature. And so as we model certain events, we're looking at how many days the public is exposed above a threshold. And this example here is 90 degrees, but again, we have the data in the background if, there's other health suggestions at 95 degrees or, a different metric that can be captured. You can also see here, this kind of has a couple of different wiggly lines across the middle. So that's saying if there's different climate futures where we are more conscious and there are more climate measures implemented, it kind of levels off towards 2060. If we don't do those measures, it's showing you, continuing to spike up and higher. What we started looking at then following that is, well, what does that mean from the worker degree hours? Really from a community standpoint, when you're looking at city staff, the concern is going to be how much can those workers be out in certain heat? And what is that going to do to them? So we're starting to look at trees and implementing trees in different areas, and what does that do, different shading. And so an interesting metric here is that we're looking at where people work, where they live, and the occupation from census data. And when we combine that, it's showing you that certain occupations are outside more times in the day. And so we have different tools and maps to present that show what that means to people. So what we want to do is we have a lot of information that's out there, so now gets to be the fun part where the city gets to start playing with data and saying, well, what if we did X, and what if we did it here, and what if we did it here, and what if we did multiple different types of adaptation actions. So from our initial planning, we met with a lot of different city stakeholders throughout the project, from emergency managers to planners to public works, parks. There's a lot of people that have been providing feedback into this process as we've gone. And this is an example of different scenarios that the city can play with via the tools. And so these are some looking here at a particular geography. That first scenario is showing you, well, what if we just looked at the Stevenson Creek area and want to prioritize funding into that area and look at elevating roads and acquiring structures? How does that change the exposure? And how does that, maybe interact with future planning activities the city's doing? And so what we have here, and I know it's a little hard to see at this scale, but you see on the top right of the graph, what that graph is showing you is it's providing you essentially a cost-benefit ratio that is showing you the return on investment for the best options at that price point. So what it's doing is it's letting the city move that tool. In this case, we were looking at elevating roads and buying out property. And again, that's something that, is not done frequently. It's even in Florida, there's not a lot of people that are purchasing houses. It does make sense in certain areas where there's a lot of concentrated geography and you can do a stormwater pond or something. But again, that's future things to consider. So in this case, what it's showing you is, what if you had $20 million that you wanted to spend only in Stevenson Creek using these two scenarios of either elevating a road or buying property? And so what the tool does is it gives you where those actions are and what that return on investment is. So already just with that little scenario, you're potentially populating part of a grant application. You're able to say, it's giving us 3.01 return on investment if we did this project. Here's an example if we had more money. Let's say you had $40 million in that area. Now your optimized actions, you go from 7 projects to 29 projects. It's showing you where they are on the map and what the cost benefit is for each of those actions. So it's just a planning tool that's going to allow the city to, think differently, to look at different geographies, to look at different adaptation measures, and see what that does for them. This is an example here where we're starting to look at trees. That's a big discussion throughout the city. It's something from the sustainability lens. We're looking at a lot of heat impacts. So where are possibly the best places to put trees? And that's what this tool is doing. It's kind of letting you look at, if you had a certain amount of money, where are the best spots to potentially put trees. And this is just another example in Coastal Zone 3, so we're moving over towards Tampa Bay here. And in this particular activity, we're looking at just elevating roads. So this is a road that is going to be frequently impacted in the future per these projections. You know, is that something that down the line the city wants to look at taking some kind of measure to reduce that vulnerability? And again, another activity here that you can do is, you know, we showed you certain geographies if the city wants to focus on just a small area. But what if the city wants to look at the panacea, they want to look at citywide? You know, if we had a bucket and we want to look at projects citywide, where's the best place to do that? And so this is just kind of giving you a lens to kind of point you in a direction of where you might want to investigate further into realistically making some strong changes in those areas. So where we are on this project, we're refining those scenarios. You know, again, this is a planning level tool. We want it to be as realistic as it can be. A lot of times there's, you know, assumptions that we can tweak and try to make a little better and inform now that we see some of the data. We're going to finalize this report, and then this is going to help the city, you know, the state of Florida. What they're doing now is after people do vulnerability assessments and they start to have an idea of where they might want to look at providing adaptation measures and doing implementation, you can now apply for those funds once you have a vulnerability assessment in place. So as we finalize this and the state of Florida opens up grant funding this summer, the city will be able to apply for that grant funding based on these results. So that's where we are with this particular project. Cassie, I don't know if you wanted to open it up, if there's particular questions or.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so now we're going to open it up for questions or comments. Like I said, you can come to the podium and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Would anybody like to come up?
Okay, real quick, so my name's, do I say anything? You can. It's Tricia. Hi, I'm Tricia. I just had a question. Good presentation. One of my thoughts in looking at this is when recommending. This one? Yes. When making recommendations about areas to plant trees, is there any thought process on the trees that are already there? Because it's going to take 20 to 30 years for a tree to get to a maturity level where it's actually going to have any beneficial effect on the city environment. We already are at extreme risk right now with Duke Energy cutting down, I'm not sure how many hundreds to thousands of trees that are mature, that are 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old trees that are already acting as that shade canopy and that cooling element in our cities. So we're obviously gathering together people to create a movement to protect these trees because this is a community resource. Please. I'm curious if you have any thought about that, because I get it, baby trees are great, but the big ones, we have that now. It's literally like it's like taking out the best part of the city to cut down all these trees. And people literally, I've talked to so many people literally come home and their tree is gone. There was no notice, there was no warning. They come home, the tree has been cut down. And then sometimes they leave a big mess there, so the owner has to clean up basically the leftovers of the tree.
So we're actually working to, because there's been so much interest in the tree and the heat side of this thing, we are working to re-up some of those models. But what we do have is a good citywide layer. It comes from the University of Maryland, and we have essentially 30 by 30 meter grids of where there is tree coverage across the city. It's not down to the tree inventory level yet, which I think is, you know, something to build upon from that. And, you know, that's the benefit of the tool too, is as the city collects better data, they can inject it back into the model, rerun the scenarios, and see what that does for things. But it certainly is, you know, longitudinal from the standpoint that we're looking at 80 years into the future, and this model simulates over time. So some of those concerns you're bringing up can get modeled into that.
Yeah, I would love that. I just would love to see us be more proactive than reactive. Are you going to say anything? I can have a copy of your presentation, please.
I think they're providing it to everybody.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I do. Dan. Big hearts to everybody. Thank you.
Brian Beckman. So when I heard some of the, I guess it was towards the end of the presentation, talking about potential grants and having this vulnerability assessment in place to help enable the award, I guess, of some of those grants. Are you also including in that potential grants that would help the city realize goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which would directly go towards reducing heat?
So this is part of a grant, and there is a phase 2 of this grant that would be for an implementation plan that we're hoping to apply for. And then we would use that grant for doing some of these mitigation strategies. But there is, as you know, a lot of federal funding out right now, and this vulnerability assessment will be the foundation for a lot of these grants that the Sustainability Division will be focusing on specifically for our carbon reduction goals.
Okay. Thanks, Casey.
Jared Leon. Thank you. I think you sort of answered my question with what Brian had asked, but I was curious, and I commend the city for putting this study together, and it's great to be, active to go forward and try to get some of these grants for these, for what the vulnerability assessment looked at what some of the problem areas are. But how will the city implement the study? And you mentioned about that phase 2. What would the timeline look like for that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, hi. We just, today is an update for the public. As Atkins was saying, they're still working on all these scenarios. And so what will happen is eventually they'll get to a final report. They'll issue that to us. We will then, review that internally with the city manager's office, potentially with one-on-ones with council members to determine the next steps.
Limbo.
Not very sustainable to crawl into the rope. Bill Johnson. I'm still trying to get my head around the process here. I keep reminding you of that, don't I? Thank you. Bill Johnson. I'm trying to get my head around the process. How do you simulate the development that's going on throughout the city and its impact on the future sustainability and whether primarily the carrying capacity of number of people on roads and that kind of thing?
So, great question. Hopefully everybody heard it. So at the beginning of this project, when we're building the digital twin of the city, one of that first steps, we had parcel data, we had future land use data, we met with the planning department and other people on the project action team. So essentially what the tool does, which, is a little harder in a community like this where you're already fairly built out, or pretty much all built out, but it looks at vacant or low-density parcels and it projects growth into the future based on the type of land use it is and guidance from the city as to areas they think are going to grow or not grow. So there is a bit of a filter at the beginning to say, if it's a church property or if it's a government property, it might not change. The airport is probably not going to change your stuff around there. What we worked with staff to say, here's where we show areas that it might grow or it might intensify. Does it make sense? There were at times it was spitting out things on Cooper's Point. It's not going to grow probably on Cooper's Point. So we went back and refined the model to do that. But again, the city will have this information, and so as the city develops, they can rerun the model based on new thoughts, new growth patterns that the city uses. And to the point of the scenario side, one of the scenarios or a couple of the scenarios that were injected from the planning group was, let's look at some of these economic corridors that we know are developing. Let's put a lens just in those areas and see if we had X amount of money, should we elevate roads? Should we do some kind of flood proofing or raise buildings? Maybe it's just dry flood proofing on a building in downtown or something so it doesn't get wet. But it's trying to help focus, where maybe to put those efforts, or at least, maybe it's another study, or maybe it's more detailed information. It probably gets needed before you get to implementation, because, it is a planning level tool, but it tries to emulate those things as best as possible.
Thank you for that presentation. I'm Kathleen Beckman. I had a question about, your slides are really dense and in-depth, and then you have like a 2-page summary that's attached to the agenda. So when is your final report going to come out that follows this PowerPoint presentation, so we can more fully understand all those dots, the colors of the dots and all that stuff? So what's that timeline?
So, my guess at this point is in the next few weeks, we'll have a draft to the city. The city, as you heard Cassie say, is also trying to build a website on this to provide more information. It is very dense, and then that's part of the problem is, how do we digest some of these graphics and outputs into something that's digestible, It is very data rich, so that is part of the process.
Okay. And then do you anticipate it being part of a dashboard where people can manipulate, maybe plug in different scenarios and see what's going to happen, or is it just kind of a standalone report with a PowerPoint presentation?
Well, as I mentioned, we're not done with the project yet, and so to determine any next steps, we're going to want to get input from, again, the city manager's office and city council, clearly.
Yeah, I was going to say this at the end, but I'll just say it now. We are building a website. It'll be myclearwater.com/vulnerability. So we'll have all the information that was in the press release. We'll have this recording of the video, and then any further reports. And we'll work with our communications team to develop some brief, shorter reports that are more, bite-sized information for the public. So this will all be, we've developed the website already. It's got some information, but we planned, because this project will be ongoing for quite some time, to have that landing page for all of our communication. No further questions or comments? All right, well, I was just going to end with that. So, for further information, myclearwater.com/vulnerability. We will be updating that, like I just mentioned, with more reports, more visual representation. And so keep an eye out on that. And of course, we have our quarterly sustainability newsletter that will be keeping updates in that as well. And if there's no other further questions or comments, thank you all for coming and have a great evening.